Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive, thrilling thought experiment about human evolution. We're going to strip away our most famous and probably most vital discovery. You know, it is just so incredibly easy to take our modern comforts for granted, but to truly understand how tough, how resilient our ancient ancestors really were, we need to completely erase the one thing that changed the trajectory of our species forever. Fire is so fundamental to our current definition of being human that imagining life without it feels, well, almost impossible. But let's try it anyway.
So, what if humans never discovered fire? Let's plunge right into this hypothetical world where our ancient ancestors never figured out how to spark a flame. I want you to really think about what that actually means. We aren't just talking about a world without weekend camping trips or roasting s'mores. No way. We're talking about a world where humanity had to survive, evolve, and somehow thrive in an environment that was constantly freezing, pitch black, and quite frankly, actively trying to eat them. All of this without any of the foundational benefits that controlled fire eventually gave us. So how on earth did they pull that off?
To really wrap our heads around this, we've got to aggressively contrast our modern reality of instant comfort against the terrifying vulnerability of prehistoric life. Just think about modern life for a second. If you're cold, you just turn on a heater. If you're hungry, you fire up the stove and cook a meal in minutes. You flip a switch to instantly banish the dark, and you lock your heavy front door to keep any danger outside. Now contrast that with the pre-fire reality. No switches, no comfortable climate-controlled homes waiting for you. It was a world defined by absolute total sensory deprivation the second the sun went down. It meant a reliance on raw, ridiculously tough foods and this constant lingering vulnerability to predators. Every single meal had to be hunted or foraged, and every single shelter had to be discovered in the wild.
All right, Section 1, a world without fire. Now, it's really important to clarify what we mean here. Natural fires absolutely existed, long before humans learned how to make or maintain them. Lightning would strike dry grass, volcanic activity would spew out flames, and wildfires would just tear through forests, leaving behind these glowing embers. Early humans definitely saw these natural infernos, but initially, fire was just another terrifying force of nature to run away from. They had absolutely no way to control it. So how did they survive the elements without it?
Which brings us to Section 2, the raw food problem. Let's start with one of the absolute most immediate challenges. Without a stove or a cozy campfire, every single calorie had to be scrounged from what the environment offered in its raw, completely unprocessed state. Our ancestors relied super heavily on fruits, leaves, seeds, raw tubers, insects, and eggs. And sure, yes, they could eat meat, but getting useful nutrition from raw animal tissues is incredibly difficult. Imagine having to chew for literally 6 to 8 hours a day just to extract enough calories to stay alive. It is definitely not like eating a modern steak. Raw meat and tough fruits are incredibly dense, super fibrous, and demand a massive amount of energy just to chew and digest.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. Early stone tools essentially became our very first technology, serving as this genius mechanical workaround for cooking. If you think about the steps involved here, you see the brilliant solution our ancestors came up with. A simple stone might look totally meaningless to us today, but back then, it was an absolute lifeline. They'd use sharp stone flakes, almost like knives, to cut through that tough meat and separate the tissue from the bone. Then, they'd use other, heavier stones as hammers to crack open those bones and access the incredibly nutritious marrow inside. They couldn't chemically soften their food with heat, right? So they mechanically processed it with tools. This stone technology was constantly improving, proving that humans didn't necessarily need a fire to extract energy from their environment.
Moving on to Section 3, surviving the dark night. Because, food was only one part of the survival equation. Let's talk about the nighttime. Imagine the sheer terror of standing in an open landscape right after sunset. Without electricity, without a trusty flashlight, and without a campfire, night meant complete, absolute darkness. In a pitch-black environment like that, you simply can't see what's moving around you. You can't tell if that rustling sound nearby is just a harmless leaf blowing in the wind or a deadly predator silently stalking you. You can't just lock a door and go to sleep safely. The psychological and physical toll of this daily darkness must have been absolutely immense. So what was the immediate solution to that terrifying darkness and, well, to survival in general? It was the group. A single human alone in the dark is highly, highly vulnerable. But a group? A group provided massive tactical advantages. Suddenly you had more eyes to watch the surroundings for predators. You had shared body heat to survive those freezing, brutal nights. And crucially, you had a collective defense system to protect the most vulnerable members of the tribe, especially the children.
So the crucial point here is that social cooperation acted as a highly advanced information network. If one person figured out that a specific plant was actually safe to eat, bam, that knowledge was instantly passed to everyone else. If someone stumbled upon a hidden, reliable water source, the whole group memorized that location. If a certain valley was swarming with dangerous predators, they learned together to steer clear of it. Survival wasn't just about who was the strongest or who could run the fastest, it was about shared intelligence. Our ancestors were actively learning from their environment and from one another, and that ability to learn was arguably just as vital as any physical trait they had.
And hey, we can't forget about the freezing cold. Without a fire to huddle around, how did they manage to not freeze to death? Well, they relied heavily on natural infrastructure. They couldn't exactly build heated homes, so they adapted to the prehistoric real estate market. Rock overhangs, deep caves, and incredibly dense vegetation became their temporary shelters. By combining these natural wind blocks with their own body posture to conserve heat, and by staying physically close to other members of their group, they actually managed to survive plunging temperatures. They literally used the environment to their advantage.
Section 4. The gradual spark. Let's see how this builds, because the introduction of fire into this equation wasn't some sudden, cinematic, eureka moment. There was no single prehistoric genius who just suddenly invented fire one Tuesday and changed humanity overnight. Instead, the mastery of fire was an incredibly slow, gradual integration into a survival system that, frankly, was already working for them.
And this process perfectly illustrates how early humans slowly domesticated fire over generations. First off, they had to be brave enough to actually harvest flames from naturally occurring fires, like those lightning strikes we talked about. Then they had to figure out how to transport and preserve those glowing embers without letting them just die out in the wind. The next major hurdle was learning how to maintain that fire, figuring out what kind of fuel to feed it to keep it alive. And finally, much, much later, they unlocked the ultimate secret: how to deliberately produce a spark entirely on their own. Every single one of these steps required deep observation and a massive, massive leap in human knowledge.
Looking back at this timeline, we can visually prove there was no single inventor of fire. It maps out a really complicated, super gradual archaeological record spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Natural fires existed way before 1 million years ago. Then, we find traces of burned plant material associated with combustion at Wonderword Cave in South Africa, which dates back roughly 1 million years. But it actually isn't until around 780,000 years ago, at a site called Gesher Banat Yaakov in Israel, that we start seeing strong, concrete evidence of truly controlled fire being used for processing food. So yeah, it was an incredibly slow burn, pun totally intended, to get to full mastery.
But of course, once it was reliably controlled, fire was an undeniable total game changer. It finally pushed back the absolute darkness of the night, providing much-needed light. It offered this beautiful, radiant warmth against the freezing cold and acted as a powerful protective barrier against any predators lurking nearby. And perhaps most importantly, it allowed for cooking. Cooking chemically softens food, makes it way easier to chew, and unlocks accessible nutrients that raw foods simply could not provide. But as absolutely transformative as fire was, it's really crucial to remember that it was just an addition to our toolkit. It didn't magically create modern humans all on its own.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 5, our greatest survival tool. Because the honest truth is, long before fire ever became a controllable tool, prehistoric humans were already successfully solving the massive, life-threatening problems of their time. Think about it. They were navigating vast, confusing landscapes without maps. They were finding and processing food without supermarkets or delivery apps. They were surviving the freezing cold without heaters and protecting their young without modern medicine or sturdy walls. They faced constant starvation, extreme weather, and deadly infections, yet they survived, generation after generation.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from this whole explainer. Fire wasn't actually what saved us. Our true, original technology was adaptation. It was our innate, relentless human curiosity, the drive to learn from our surroundings, to cooperate deeply with our groups, and to pass that hard-won knowledge down to the next generation. That is the real technology that kept humanity alive in the dark. So, to wrap things up, I want you to ask yourself this one final question. If human curiosity and collective adaptation were powerful enough to keep our ancestors alive in a pitch-black, freezing world with literally nothing but sharp stones, what seemingly impossible challenges can our collective intelligence solve today?